Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so get ready because we're diving into a pretty intense period of history.
Intense is a good word for it.
Yeah, we're talking about the late 1960s and the counterculture movement.
Definitely a turning point in American history.
And you've given us a lot to work with here. Articles, podcast excerpts.
Even some personal notes.
Yeah, so much to unpack.
A lot of different perspectives on this one.
Definitely. So before we get to the big moments like Woodstock, let's
The really well-known things.
Yeah, exactly. Let's step back for a second. What even was the counterculture?
Right. Was it just about peace signs and tie-dye?
Or was there something more going on?
Oh, there was definitely something deeper going on. It went way beyond the aesthetics. I mean, the counterculture was basically challenging the entire foundation of American society.
Whoa. Okay, so what do you mean by that?
Well, they were pushing back against materialism, traditional family structures, even the whole idea of what success meant.
So they were looking at like the world their parents built and saying,
Nope, we're not buying it.
wow. And you mentioned the Vietnam War earlier.
Right.
And from the sources, it seems like the war was a huge turning point.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just about being anti-war.
Yeah.
It was more about this, like, deep distrust of authority that started to emerge.
Yeah, like they lost faith in the government.
Exactly. One historian in an article you shared said that Vietnam really shattered this illusion of a benevolent government. The counterculture started to see the people in power not as protectors, but as part of the problem.
And that distrust kind of fueled their activism, right?
Definitely their desire to create a more peaceful world, a more compassionate world. Of course, that leads us to that iconic slogan.
Oh, you mean make love, not war.
Exactly. Such a simple phrase, but so powerful. On one hand, it's a clear anti-war message, but on another, it's embracing this idea of free love, open relationships, rejecting all those societal norms around sexuality.
Yeah, they weren't afraid to challenge anything, the personal and the political.
Absolutely.
And speaking of challenging norms, we can't talk about the counterculture without mentioning the Beat generation.
The beatniks.
Yeah, these guys like Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, they were rebelling even before the 60s.
Oh yeah, they were the pioneers, the ones who paved the way.
Like the counterculture's older siblings.
I like that analogy. Their emphasis on self-expression, freedom, rejecting the rat race.
Yeah.
It all shows up again in the counterculture movement.
It's like they planted the seeds.
And then the 60s came along, and those seeds blossomed.
Exactly. And from those seeds grew some incredible events like Woodstock.
Woodstock.
It's become this legendary symbol of the counterculture. But what was it really like to be there?
Well, just imagine 400,000 people gathered in a field for 3 days of music and communal living.
It sounds unreal.
It was more than a concert. It was like an experiment in utopia.
Whoa.
Yeah. In that history podcast excerpt you shared, there's a first-hand account from someone who was actually at Woodstock.
Oh, wow.
They talk about how it felt like anything was possible, like they were part of something truly transformative.
I'm getting chills just thinking about it.
It must have been incredible.
And then you had those legendary performers.
Like who?
Well, Joan Baez's Jefferson Airplane.
Oh, yeah. And of course,
Jimi Hendrix.
his Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock has become almost like an anthem.
Right. It's so iconic.
And it wasn't just him playing the notes, it was a statement. He used feedback and distortion to mimic the sounds of war bombs exploding gunfire.
Yeah, it's powerful.
It was one article you shared described it as a sonic representation of the chaos and violence of war.
It must have been so intense to witness that.
Truly a moment in history.
So we have Woodstock, this almost like idyllic vision of peace and love.
Right. The hope.
And then just 4 months later, you have Altamont, which paints a much darker picture.
Yeah, Altamont exposed the undercurrents, the darker side of the counterculture.
Sounds like a Shakespearean tragedy.
This rapid shift from euphoria to something much darker.
It's heartbreaking in a way.
It definitely makes you think. It was meant to be another Woodstock, you know.
Another free concert.
Yeah, this one was organized by the Rolling Stones.
Okay.
But the thing is, they made this huge mistake.
Oh, yeah. What was it?
They hired the Hells Angels for security.
Yeah, that detail really stood out in the sources.
Right.
It seems so naive looking back, knowing their reputation for violence.
It really was. And, you know, the atmosphere was tense from the start.
Oh, I bet.
And then tragically it happened.
You mean?
Yeah, a young black man named Meredith Hunter was killed
Killed during the concert.
during the Stones performance.
It's hard to even
It
imagine.
was a chaotic scene.
And the sources mentioned that Hunter's death was actually caught on film.
Right, it was captured on film.
That must have been a turning point.
Definitely a wake-up call for the movement.
Like, the reality of violence couldn't be ignored anymore.
Exactly. It shattered this illusion of peace and love.
Right. It showed that even within a movement for change, there could be danger.
Absolutely.
It's a lot to process.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
It makes you see the complexities of that era. I mean, you
Right.
have Woodstock on the one hand.
The idealism.
Yeah, and then Altamont forcing everyone to confront this darker side.
And sadly, the darkness didn't end there.
What do you mean?
Well, the early 70s saw the deaths of some really important figures.
Oh, you're talking about.
Jimi Hendrix,
Right.
Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, all from drug overdoses.
It's so tragic.
It is. And, it's easy to see those deaths as symbolic of the movement's decline.
I mean, I can see why people would think that.
Right. But I think it's important to remember that these were complex individuals with their own struggles.
Right, not just symbols.
Exactly. Reducing their deaths to just a symptom of a failing movement.
Mm.
I think it oversimplifies things.
Yeah, you're right. So as we look back at the counterculture, how do historians make sense of all of this?
Well, it's complicated. There's no easy answer.
And the sources mention there are quite a few different perspectives.
Definitely, historians don't always agree on a single interpretation.
So what are some of the different viewpoints?
Well, some historians tend to lean towards more progressive viewpoints,
Okay.
and they see the counterculture as a force for positive change.
Okay, like what kind of change?
Well, they point to things like the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement,
Mm.
the push for women's liberation. All those movements gained a lot of momentum during this time.
So for them, the counterculture helped create those changes.
Yeah, they see it as a challenge to oppressive norms, a push for greater equality.
I can see that. But what about other perspectives?
Well, then you have historians who come from a more conservative viewpoint,
Okay.
and they might focus on things like the breakdown of traditional values, the increase in drug use, the embrace of free love.
So they see it as a negative.
Well, they might argue that it led to a decline in social order and morality.
It's interesting how the same events can be interpreted so differently.
Depending on your perspective.
Are there any other viewpoints that fall outside of those two categories?
Yeah, there are. Some historians, particularly cultural historians, really emphasize the impact on generations.
What do you mean?
They argue that the counterculture created a huge rift between the younger generation and their parents.
Oh, wow, like a clash of values.
Exactly, and they say that continues even to this day.
So it wasn't just about politics or social change.
It was a fundamental shift in how generations related to each other.
That's a really interesting point. And what about the psychological side of things?
Oh, well, you have the psychohistorians.
Right.
They're the ones who really delve into the motivations behind the counterculture.
Okay, so what do they say?
Well, they might argue that the trauma of World War II and the Cold War created this deep anxiety, this disillusionment.
And that led to the rejection of traditional values.
Exactly.
Wow, it's amazing how many different lenses we can use to view this one movement.
It reminds us that history is rarely simple.
Right. There are always so many shades of gray.
Exactly. And when we consider all these different viewpoints, what can we even say about the counterculture's overall legacy?
It's tough to say definitively, but it definitely left a mark on music, art, fashion, our ideas about freedom.
Oh, yeah. Its impact is undeniable.
But it also seems like a mixed bag.
In what way?
Well, there's progress and disillusionment, hope and tragedy all mixed together.
That's a great way to put it. The counterculture's legacy is complex and multifaceted. It sparked incredible creativity and pushed for social change.
But it also revealed a potential for chaos and self-destruction.
Right. It's a reminder that even with the best intentions, things can get messy, unpredictable.
Yeah, you can have progress, but also unintended consequences. Makes you wonder, did it succeed or fail? I mean...
It's hard to say, right?
Yeah.
Maybe success or failure isn't even the right way to think about it.
What do you mean?
Well, I think it's more about the impact it had, the mark it left on society.
Okay, so what was that, Mark?
The counterculture forced America to confront some really tough things.
Like what?
Its contradictions, its inequalities,
Yeah.
those deep-rooted social norms. It challenged the status quo and really paved the way for future movements for social change.
And one thing that's clear from these sources is the impact on music and art.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
We're still listening to the music, watching the films, reading the books that came out of that era.
It was a period of such incredible artistic innovation, pushing the boundaries of creative expression in every way.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
It is how all this social and political upheaval gave birth to such incredible art.
It shows how connected everything is, right? Art, politics, culture.
Yeah, they all feed into each other.
So I guess that's a key takeaway from this whole deep dive.
What's that?
The counterculture wasn't just about protests and, the stereotypical stuff.
It was so much more.
It was this complex movement that changed American society.
And we're still dealing with those changes today.
Yeah, it makes you think about how the past shapes the present.
Right, those big questions about freedom, social justice, challenging authority.
They're still so relevant.
And it's important to remember that the counterculture wasn't one big unified thing.
What do you mean?
Well, there were tensions, disagreements, different groups within the movement.
Okay.
Like you had the peace-loving hippies, the more radical activists, the artists, pushing the boundaries of expression.
So many different perspectives.
It was this melting pot of ideas and ideals. And that's part of what made it so dynamic, so influential.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from all of this?
I'd say it's this middle triac. Don't think of history as just a bunch of facts.
What do you mean?
It's not static. It's an ongoing conversation.
Okay.
The counterculture shows us that history is full of complexity, contradictions, different perspectives.
Yeah, that's definitely come through in our deep dive.
It's up to us to engage with all of that,
To keep asking questions.
and to draw our own conclusions about the past and what it means for us today.
That's a great point. So if
yeah.
this deep dive has sparked your curiosity,
What should they do?
I think keep exploring. Go back and revisit some of that music, the films, the writings from that era.
Yeah, you might be surprised by how much they still speak to you today.
And who knows, maybe you'll even discover something new about yourself.
That's the beauty of exploring the past.
Right. It can change how we see the present.
And maybe even the future.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the heart of the counterculture.
It's been a fascinating journey.
Definitely until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.